Imagine waking up one day to discover that the person you trust the most, the one who should be your safe haven, is actually the source of your worst nightmare. In a world where love is celebrated as the greatest force, few recognize that it can also be the most dangerous weapon, used to manipulate, control, and destroy lives silently and unsuspectingly. In this disturbing story, you will learn how Caroline Crouch's fairy tale turned into a deadly trap, revealing unsettling truths about human nature and how, often, the danger might be closer than we think. If you think you know the signs of an abusive relationship, get ready to be challenged. The truth may be much darker than you imagine. Caroline Crouch was like any other teenager, full of dreams and expectations about the future. On the small island of Alonissos, where she grew up, her life seemed simple and predictable. The daughter of a retired engineer and a devoted mother, Caroline was a girl who loved the sea, spending hours swimming and exploring the crystal-clear waters that surrounded her home. But, like every young girl, she dreamed of something more, something that would take her out of her routine and lead her to an exciting life full of love. It was during a Good Friday parade in 2017 that Caroline met Babish Anagnostopoulos, a helicopter pilot with an irresistible charm. He was 27 years old, 12 years older than her, but the age difference seemed irrelevant in the face of the instant chemistry that arose between them. Babish was everything Caroline imagined in a man. Confident, successful, and above all, charming. He won her over with his ability to make it seem as if the world revolved around her, as if she were the only person that mattered. In no time, Caroline was completely in love, willing to follow Babish wherever he went. Babish wasted no time in captivating her even more. He would fly over Caroline's school in his helicopter, showing off to her and everyone who watched with admiration and envy. The young girl, impressed and flattered by the attention, began to see Babish as the man of her dreams. The idea of escaping to a new and exciting life by his side seemed like an irresistible fantasy. And so, at 18 years old, Caroline made the choice that would change her life forever. She eloped with Babish to get married in Portugal, leaving behind the quiet life she knew. The marriage, celebrated in secret, was the beginning of a new life for Caroline, a life she believed was a realized fairy tale. They returned to Athens and settled in a charming maisonette in the city's suburbs. Babish, with his financial stability and promises of building a future together, was the Prince Charming Caroline had always dreamed of. She was happy, or at least she wanted to believe she was. But, like every fairy tale, there was a dark side that Caroline couldn't yet see. Over time, Babish began to show a side of his personality that Caroline hadn't anticipated. He became increasingly controlling, questioning her friendships, monitoring her activities, and eventually isolating her from the outside world. Caroline, still in love, saw these actions as proof of Babish's love, a demonstration that he wanted her all to himself. But, in reality, he was weaving a web of control and manipulation around her, a web that would tighten more with each passing day. Gradually, Caroline began to realize that the man she had married was not exactly what he appeared to be. The small arguments began to become more frequent, and Babish always found a way to blame her for the couple's problems. He made her question her own sanity, leading her to believe that maybe she was really responsible for what was happening. The dream of a perfect marriage was beginning to crumble, but Caroline still couldn't see the full extent of the nightmare that was coming. The young mother, now with a small daughter, felt increasingly trapped in a relationship that suffocated her. The memories of the beginning, of helicopter flights and promises of eternal love, were starting to fade, giving way to a constant sense of fear and anxiety. Something was terribly wrong, but Caroline still couldn't fully understand what it was. However, deep down, she knew that a storm was forming on the horizon, and that soon, the fairy tale would turn into an unimaginable horror. Welcome to Spooky Stories. I'm Milo, your guide through the chilling and the unknown. Here, we dive into terrifying tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Join our community of thrill seekers, and let's explore the darkness together. If you're curious about how I keep my concentration, efficiency, performance, and mental health at their peak every day, I'm going to share with you 2 resources that I use daily in my video creation routine. First, breathing for sleep. This method is essential for my deep, restful nights, ensuring I wake up refreshed and ready to create high-quality content. And the best part? It's super easy to incorporate into your routine. And then there's the 7 seconds at-home ritual. This ritual is backed by 4 neuroscience studies and helps to supercharge my brain power, keeping my focus sharp throughout the entire day. Want to try these resources and feel the difference in your routine? The links are right here in the video description and pinned in the comments. Don't miss this chance to elevate your productivity and mental well-being. In the early hours of May 11th, 2021, the house of Caroline and Babish was engulfed in an unsettling silence. The shadows of the trees outside danced on the bedroom walls, moved by a breeze that heralded something dark. Caroline slept beside her 11-month-old daughter, Lydia, while Babish, downstairs, was reviewing work documents. He seemed calm, but there was something in the depths of his eyes that suggested a restlessness, an internal conflict that he could no longer hide. Shortly before 4:30 a.m., Babish heard a noise that made him look up from what he was doing. A subtle sound, like a distant rustling, but enough to put him on alert. He got up, walking toward the stairs that led to the bedroom. Halfway there, the house was suddenly filled with a violent crash as 3 masked men broke down the front door. In seconds, Babish was surrounded and thrown to the ground, his screams muffled by the sound of the quick and aggressive footsteps of the invaders. Caroline woke up to the sounds of struggle and heavy footsteps climbing the stairs. Her heart raced, a mix of confusion and terror taking over. Before she could understand what was happening, the bedroom door was flung open, and the men entered, one of them holding a gun pointed directly at her. Lydia, still asleep, began to cry, her cries echoing through the room like a desperate plea for help. Caroline tried to protect her daughter, but was quickly overpowered by the intruders, who brutally tied her up. Babish, now bound and gagged downstairs, could hear Caroline's screams and Lydia's incessant crying. He fought against his restraints, his body trembling with adrenaline and fear. But the men were relentless. They demanded to know where the money was, where the jewelry was. Caroline, terrified, screamed that there was nothing for them, that everything they had was in a simple board game. The assailants, angry, didn't believe her. The violence against Caroline intensified as Lydia cried nonstop beside her. Finally, the men found the money hidden in the Monopoly game. But their fury did not subside. They wanted more, something Caroline could not give. Desperate, she begged for their lives, for the lives of her daughter and husband. But the coldness in the eyes of the intruders revealed that they had no compassion, no mercy. One of the men held Caroline tightly, pressing a pillow over her face as she struggled to breathe. The struggle was brief, but full of despair. Caroline felt life slowly slipping away as she heard, in the distance, her daughter's cries and Babish's muffled screams. When Babish regained consciousness, the silence in the house was deafening. He managed, with superhuman effort, to crawl to his phone and call emergency services using his nose. The words came out amidst sobs and grunts muffled by the tape over his mouth, but he managed to say enough. "Robbers? My wife? My baby? Please help." But it was too late. Caroline, the great love of his life, was dead. When the first police officers arrived at Caroline and Babish's home shortly after 6 a.m., they were greeted by a scene of destruction. The front door was ajar with visible marks of forced entry. The furniture was overturned, drawers open, and personal belongings scattered across the floor, as if a hurricane had swept through. In the center of the living room, a Monopoly box lay on its side, its contents spilled on the floor, a bitter reminder of where the couple had hidden their savings. But what really shocked the officers was what they found as they followed the muffled sounds of crying coming from upstairs. Climbing the stairs, the officers found the lifeless body of Roxy, the family's husky puppy, hanging from the staircase, strangled with its own leash. The cruelty of the scene caused nausea among the officers, but they knew they had to continue. In the master bedroom, the sight was even more distressing. Babish lay on the floor, with his hands and feet bound, his face covered with tape. Beside him, Caroline lay face down on the bed, her body lifeless. Next to her, Lydia cried, trying to wake her mother with clumsy, gentle touches, unable to comprehend the terrible reality that had befallen her family. The paramedics were called immediately, but they already knew there was nothing to be done for Caroline. Her skin was pale, lifeless, and her eyes, which once shone with the hope of a happy future, were now empty, reflecting the brutal end of a fairy tale that had turned into a nightmare. Babish, still in shock, was freed from his restraints. His first reaction upon seeing his wife's body was one of pure despair. He screamed, a guttural sound that echoed through the house, a cry of pain that seemed endless. As the paramedics tended to Lydia, trying to calm and comfort her, the police began to inspect the crime scene. The place, destroyed and ransacked, told a story of violence and despair, but something didn't add up. The brutality of the attack seemed disproportionate to the criminal's objective, who had taken only a relatively small amount of money and some jewelry. And why kill Caroline and the dog, leaving Babish and the baby alive? These questions began to form in the investigators' minds as they tried to piece together the puzzle. Suspicions began to arise when the police found no conclusive evidence pointing to the alleged intruders. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, nothing that could identify the perpetrators. The only clue was Babish's account of the 3 hooded men who had bound and tortured him before killing his wife. But something about Babish's behavior began to unsettle the investigators. He seemed overly cooperative, detailing every aspect of what had occurred, but his eyes, still red from crying, did not convey the genuine pain expected of someone who had just lost his wife in such a tragic way. Amid all this confusion, a crucial detail began to emerge. The living room security camera had been damaged, and its memory card was missing. Babish claimed the criminals had removed it, but the police began to question that version. Why would someone who broke into a house looking for money and jewelry take the trouble to remove a memory card unless they knew exactly what they were doing? This and other inconsistencies began to form a cloud of suspicion around Babish, turning what seemed to be a home invasion case into something much more sinister. While the authorities mounted an operation to find the supposed intruders, suspicions about Babish continued to grow. His account, no matter how detailed, did not completely align with the evidence, or the lack of it, at the crime scene. Something was terribly wrong, and the truth, buried under layers of lies and deception, was about to come to light, bringing with it a revelation that would shock Greece and the world. As the police continued their investigation, public attention turned to the case of Caroline Crouch. The Greek media became obsessed with the tragedy, covering every detail of the crime and turning Babish into a figure of sympathy. He was the devastated husband, the lonely father who had lost everything in an inexplicable act of violence. But behind the cameras, the investigators were beginning to see a different picture, one where the pieces didn't fit as they should. The investigators began to scrutinize Babish's statements, analyzing every word, every detail. The first doubts arose when it was revealed that the memory from Caroline's smartwatch showed a significant discrepancy between the time of her death and the moment Babish claimed the criminals broke into the house. According to the device, Caroline's heart stopped at 4:11 a.m., a time before Babish had declared. This discovery cast an even greater shadow over the widower's account, suggesting that he might be hiding something much more sinister. Another crucial clue was discovered on Babish's phone. The fitness app on his phone showed that he was moving around during the period he claimed to be tied up and unable to move. The police recreated the crime scene, trying to replicate how Babish supposedly dialed the emergency number with his nose, as he had claimed. The attempts were unsuccessful, further raising suspicions that his story was full of inconsistencies. As the evidence against Babish piled up, the police made a crucial decision. They decided not to publicly reveal their suspicions while they gathered more proof. Instead, they continued to treat Babish as a victim, gaining his trust while discreetly preparing the ground for a confrontation. Babish, unaware that he was under surveillance, continued to give emotional interviews, always emphasizing his pain and suffering, maintaining the facade of a man devastated by loss. But Babish's charade began to unravel when the police discovered that Caroline had attempted to flee from him the night before the murder. Messages on her phone showed that she was planning to leave Babish and take Lydia with her. Caroline had even tried to book a hotel to spend the night away from home, but something had stopped her from following through with the plan. These revelations brought forth a new theory. What if Babish, fearing he would lose control over Caroline, had taken a drastic measure to ensure she never left him? Finally, the time came for the police to act. On June 17, 2021, during a memorial service for Caroline, investigators approached Babish and invited him to accompany them to Athens. They claimed to have found a new suspect and needed him to identify the person. Babish, suspecting nothing, agreed, still immersed in the belief that he was one step ahead of the authorities. But what awaited him in Athens was not a simple identification. It was an ambush. Upon arriving at the police station, Babish was confronted with all the inconsistencies and evidence the police had gathered against him. Initially, he tried to defend himself, claiming that everything he had said was true. But after hours of intense interrogation, the pressure became unbearable. Finally, Babish broke down and confessed to what really happened that fateful night. But even in his confession, he tried to manipulate the narrative, presenting himself as a victim of circumstances, claiming that Caroline's death had been a tragic accident caused by a heated argument. Babish's confession shocked Greece. The man who had deceived the country, who had mourned his murdered wife and received public support, was actually the cold-blooded killer who had planned and executed the crime with calculated precision. The fairy tale had turned into a nightmare of horror and betrayal, leaving the public in a state of shock and disbelief. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows, revealing the extent of Babish's cruelty and the ultimate price Caroline had paid. Babish Anagnostopoulos' confession opened the floodgates to a torrent of revelations. He admitted to killing Caroline after an argument that spiraled out of control, but the investigators knew there was more to this simplistic narrative. The brutality of the crime, the meticulous planning of the scene to make it look like a robbery, and the coldness with which he attempted to manipulate everyone around him pointed to a man who didn't just act in a moment of rage, but who had orchestrated a plan to ensure he would get away with it, even at the cost of the woman he swore to love. During the interrogation, Babish tried to justify his actions, claiming that Caroline had become violent, that she was threatening to leave him and take their daughter. He said that, in the heat of the moment, he lost control. But the investigators were not fooled by this attempt to humanize his actions. The evidence painted a picture of premeditation. Babish had removed the memory card from the security camera hours before the crime, an act that indicated he was planning what would happen next. As he confessed, Babish detailed how he placed his daughter next to Caroline's lifeless body, a scene created to evoke sympathy and horror at the same time. He killed the family dog, Roxy, as part of his plan to make the staging even more convincing. In his account, Babish seemed less like a remorseful man and more like someone trying to rationalize an unspeakable act, as if convinced that he could manipulate even the police, just as he had manipulated everyone else. The police also discovered that Caroline had confided in a close friend, days before her death, that she was afraid of Babish. She had mentioned that he was becoming increasingly controlling and that she was seriously considering leaving him. This revelation drove another nail into the coffin of Babish's defense, suggesting that the murder was not the result of an accidental argument, but rather the tragic end of a relationship marked by manipulation, control, and fear. With Babish's confession, the case quickly became a media spectacle. Greece, which initially saw Babish as a victim, now turned against him with indignation and disgust. Images of Caroline, a young mother full of life and promise, were displayed in every newspaper and television program, always accompanied by dark details of how her dream of love had turned into a bloody nightmare. The narrative of the devoted husband was dismantled, revealing a man obsessed with control, willing to do anything to maintain the illusion of perfection. Babish's trial became a national event. He was charged with premeditated murder, animal abuse, and lying to authorities. During the proceedings, he continued to present a distorted version of the events, trying to minimize his guilt, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The court heard witnesses who spoke about Babish's controlling behavior, how he isolated Caroline from friends and family, and the signs of emotional abuse she had suffered. Caroline was gradually being transformed from the victim of a random crime into the victim of a toxic and abusive marriage. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. Babish Anagnostopoulos was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. The sentence brought some relief to Caroline's family, but the pain of losing a daughter, a sister, a friend in such a brutal way was a wound that would never fully heal. Justice had been served, but the void left by Caroline's death was something that no one could fill. The media followed the conclusion with attention, highlighting the tragic irony of a man who tried to deceive the entire world, but who ended up being condemned by his own lies. Babish, who once controlled every aspect of Caroline's life, ended up alone, locked in a cell, with no one to blame but himself. The fairy tale he had promised Caroline unraveled, leaving behind only a trail of destruction and pain. With Babish Anagnostopoulos sentenced, the public's attention gradually shifted to other stories. But for those directly involved, the shadow of what happened would never fully disappear. The island of Alonissos, once a peaceful and paradisiacal refuge, now bore the scars of a tragedy that shook its community. Caroline's funeral had been an event filled with pain, but also a sense of disbelief. How could someone so young, so full of life, have their fate sealed in such a brutal manner? Caroline's parents, David and Susan, returned to the island, trying to find some comfort in a place that once brought them so much joy. But the constant presence of tourists, many of whom were attracted by morbid curiosity about the case, made the island almost unrecognizable to them. Every corner, every street now seemed laden with painful memories, and what was once a personal paradise had become a place haunted by recent events. They retreated, trying to protect what was left of their privacy, while struggling to cope with the unbearable loss of their daughter. Lydia, the daughter of Caroline and Babish, was placed in the care of her maternal grandparents. The little girl, who had been a symbol of hope and renewal for the young mother, was now a constant reminder of what had been taken from her. David and Susan dedicated themselves to raising her, trying their best to provide a normal and loving life despite the absence of her mother and the father who had turned into a monster. But they knew that one day they would have to explain the truth to their granddaughter, a burden that weighed on them every day. Meanwhile, Caroline's story continued to echo in the media, turning into documentaries and television programs that explored the darkest aspects of the case. Psychologists and criminologists debated what had driven Babish to commit such a heinous crime. Some spoke about the culture of control and possession that permeates many relationships, while others focused on Babish's psychological profile, trying to understand how someone could hide so much violence behind a mask of charm and normality. But deep down, everyone knew that these explanations, however logical they might be, could never fully capture the essence of the horror Caroline had experienced. The case also raised important questions about domestic violence in Greece. The revelations about the control and manipulation Babish exerted over Caroline brought to light conversations about how to recognize the signs of abusive relationships. Women's rights advocacy groups used Caroline's story as a call to action, seeking to create more resources and support for victims of domestic violence. Amid the tragedy, there was an effort to ensure that Caroline's death was not in vain, that her legacy could save other women from similar fates. But despite all the efforts to make sense of the tragedy, the truth was that Caroline's loss left a void impossible to fill. Her life, which began with so much potential, was cruelly cut short by someone who was supposed to protect her. And while the world kept turning, for those who knew and loved her, the pain persisted, a wound that time could not heal. In his cell, Babish was left alone with his thoughts, the echo of his actions surrounding him every moment. He, who once controlled every aspect of Caroline's life, now found himself without any control, facing an eternity of regret and isolation. The illusion he had created for himself had crumbled, leaving him naked before the inescapable truth of his own character. Caroline Crouch's story, a story that began as a fairy tale, ended in a nightmare, but its consequences would continue to resonate, reminding the world of the fragility of life and the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected places. Now that you know the true face of this dark fairy tale, ask yourself, would you be able to identify the signs of a toxic relationship before it's too late? How many times have you ignored a warning in the name of love, believing everything would get better? Caroline Crouch's story isn't just a tragedy. It's a warning that manipulation and control might be closer than you think. So, how will you apply this knowledge in your life? Will you continue ignoring the signs, or will you take control of your destiny? If you want to keep learning how to protect yourself and uncover the darkest mysteries hidden in real-life stories, subscribe to the Spooky Stories channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any new stories that could change the way you see the world around you. Change starts with awareness, and every new story is an opportunity to learn how to protect yourself and those you love. Don't miss the chance to always stay one step ahead. Now that you understand the dark side that can lurk behind the quest for fame and validation on social media, it's time to reflect. Are you prepared to face the consequences of your online actions? Do you really know who is on the other side of the screen? Or are you just being lulled into a false sense of security and control? The truth is, in the digital age, the line between admirer and predator can be thinner than you think. So, how will you protect your privacy and safety moving forward? And, more importantly, how will you use this knowledge to navigate the vast online world more consciously and safely? If you want to keep learning about the hidden dangers lurking in the shadows of online life and understand how to protect yourself, subscribe now to the Spooky Stories channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any new stories and can continue deepening your knowledge on topics that could literally save your life. Let's journey together towards a safer and more informed life. Are you ready for this change?